Millionaire enters restaurant and freezes, seeing his black ex-wife pregnant. Serving tables, the crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant cast warm light across tables, where power brokers feast while reshaping global markets. But tech mogul David Sterling sees none of the luxury as he freezes in the doorway, his heart stopping at the sight of a woman whose grace once filled his world with meaning before pride destroyed everything they'd built together. There, moving between tables with the quiet dignity that time hasn't dimmed, is Amara, his ex-wife, 6 months pregnant, her dark skin glowing with the radiance of new life as she serves clients whose wealth couldn't purchase the character that poverty has only refined in the 2 years since their divorce. The irony cuts like a blade. The woman he abandoned for not fitting his social circle's expectations now works in the very establishment where those same people dine, her presence a living reminder of the love he traded for acceptance, the authenticity he sacrificed for status, the happiness he destroyed through choices that seemed rational until consequences made them unforgivable. David's paralysis in the restaurant's entrance creates minor disruption as Manhattan's elite wait behind him. Their impatience growing with each second, he stands motionless while processing the sight of Amara moving through the dining room with professional efficiency that her circumstances demand, but her dignity transforms into something approaching artistry. The maitre d' clears his throat diplomatically, but David remains frozen as memories cascade through his mind. Their wedding day, when she'd promised to love him despite his family's disapproval. Their early years when her intelligence and warmth had made his apartment feel like home. The slow erosion of their marriage as his business success created pressure to conform to social expectations that had no room for love that transcended racial boundaries his privilege had never forced him to acknowledge or defend. 2 years ago, Amara had been Dr. Amara Sterling, practicing pediatrician whose compassion with sick children matched her brilliance in medical diagnosis. Her career flourishing alongside his technology empire until his mother's threats about inheritance and his business partner's casual racism convinced him that their marriage had become liability rather than blessing, burden rather than source of strength that had actually fueled his early success when love provided motivation that money alone couldn't generate. The divorce papers he'd filed claimed irreconcilable differences, but truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd chosen social acceptance over authentic love, financial security over emotional integrity, the approval of people whose respect meant nothing compared to the woman whose heart he'd broken through cowardice disguised as pragmatism. Now she serves tables in uniform that can't diminish the regal bearing that medical school had refined, but that inner strength had always possessed. Her movements, economical and graceful despite pregnancy, that she carries with natural elegance that wealth can't purchase or poverty can't erode, when character provides foundation that circumstances can test, but never truly shake in people whose worth transcends external validation. The wedding ring he'd given her has disappeared, replaced by hands that work for survival rather than satisfaction, that serve strangers who don't recognize the brilliant mind that memorized pharmaceutical interactions, while these same fingers now memorize menu items and table assignments in restaurant, that pays fraction of what her medical practice had earned before his abandonment destroyed more than just their marriage. David finally forces movement, following the maitre d' to his reserved table while stealing glances at Amara as she moves through dining room with professional competence that her situation demands, but that her dignity elevates beyond mere service work into something approaching performance art, when necessity becomes stage for demonstrating grace under pressure that his betrayal had created but couldn't destroy in woman whose strength he'd never fully appreciated until losing it became consequence of choices that seemed logical at the time, but that perspective reveals as moral failure disguised as business decision. The irony burns as he settles in a chair that costs more than she likely earns in weeks, his wealth surrounding him with luxury that feels empty without meaning that relationship had provided. Success that tastes like ashes when flavored with recognition of what he'd sacrificed to achieve social acceptance from people whose approval now seems meaningless compared to love he'd destroyed through weakness that had masqueraded as strength when conformity had felt easier than defending choices that courage would have demanded if character had matched ambition and hierarchy of values that his upbringing had skewed toward appearance rather than authenticity. His dinner companions, investment bankers and corporate lawyers whose racism he'd enabled through silence, discussed deals worth millions while remaining oblivious to the pregnant black woman serving their wine. Their casual dismissal of her humanity, creating context that makes David's betrayal feel even more monstrous as he realizes that he'd chosen alliance with people who couldn't see Amara's worth over partnership with women whose value they'd never recognize because prejudice had blinded them to everything that made their marriage the best thing that had ever happened to someone whose privilege had never taught him to recognize authentic treasure when society trained him to value fool's gold instead. The moment Amara approaches his table creates earthquake in David's carefully constructed world as 2 years of regret collide with present reality that forces confrontation between the man he'd become and the husband he'd failed to remain when social pressure had proven stronger than marital vows. Financial considerations had outweighed emotional commitments, and fear of judgment had overcome love that should have made him brave rather than cowardly when their relationship faced challenges. That genuine partnership would have conquered together rather than allowing division to destroy what building together had achieved through mutual support and shared vision. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Amara, and I'll be your server tonight," she says, her voice carrying professional warmth that can't quite hide the shock of recognition that David sees flash across features he'd once memorized in intimate moments, when love made studying her face feel like sacred privilege rather than casual observation, when their marriage had meant everything before his choices reduced it to nothing through abandonment that no amount of success could justify or repair. Her hand trembles slightly as she pours water, the only sign that seeing him has affected composure that service work demands, but that their history makes nearly impossible to maintain when past and present collide in moment that neither had prepared for, despite knowing this encounter was inevitable in city where their worlds would eventually intersect. David's business partners continue their conversation about hostile takeovers and market manipulation, their voices providing soundtrack to personal devastation that unfolds silently as he studies Amara's face for signs of the love that his betrayal had destroyed, searching for evidence that forgiveness might be possible despite understanding that some wounds cut too deep for healing when trust becomes casualty of choices that seem necessary at the time, but that hindsight reveals as moral failure disguised as practical decision. Her pregnancy glow can't hide exhaustion that comes from working jobs that educated professionals shouldn't need, but that his abandonment had made necessary when divorce had destroyed more than just their marriage, creating financial devastation that physician's salary had barely begun to recover before his departure left her struggling to maintain medical practice while processing emotional trauma that professional competence couldn't cure. "Amara," David whispers when his companions become distracted by heated discussion about regulatory compliance, his voice carrying recognition and regret that 2 years of separation had refined into understanding that comes too late for redemption, but not too late for acknowledgement of failure that time had made impossible to ignore or rationalize away through comfortable lies about necessity that had disguised cowardice, when courage would have demanded defending love rather than abandoning it. When social pressure had demanded choices between authenticity and acceptance that his character had been too weak to navigate with integrity intact. Her response comes as professional smile that doesn't reach eyes where he once saw infinite love, but now finds carefully controlled distance that service requires when facing customers who must remain anonymous rather than personal. When survival demands emotional protection that his betrayal had taught her to maintain as defense against additional wounds that vulnerability might enable if trust became foolish rather than healing, when history proves that some people choose convenience over commitment when circumstances demand strength that his choices had revealed he didn't possess despite successful facade that business achievements had created while personal integrity had crumbled under pressure. "I'm sorry, sir," Do we know each other? Amara asks, her words carefully chosen to create professional distance that protects her from recognition that could make service impossible, while avoiding direct lie that would compromise integrity that his betrayal had tested but not destroyed when character proved stronger than circumstances that might have broken spirits less tempered by principles that remained intact despite external pressures that had challenged everything she believed about love, marriage, and the reliability of people whose vows had seemed sincere until tested by consequences that revealed true priorities when social acceptance competed with personal commitment for determining choices that define character through actions rather than just words. The question hits David like physical blow as he realizes that Amara has chosen to pretend not to recognize him. Her strategy protecting both professional obligations and personal dignity while avoiding seeing that could create problems for employment. That pregnancy makes essential despite education that should have provided better options before his abandonment had destroyed financial stability that dual medical careers had created through shared effort and mutual support that their marriage had represented before his choices had reduced partnership to painful memory that service work now forces her to confront when their worlds collide in establishment where his wealth pays for meals that are labor, makes possible an economy that rewards capital while exploiting work in patterns that his privilege had never forced him to understand until witnessing consequences of his moral failure made abstract inequality, suddenly personal and devastating in ways that business school had never taught. As dinner progresses, David watches Amara navigate between tables with grace that pregnancy and circumstance can't diminish. Her professional competence masking exhaustion that comes from working multiple jobs while carrying child whose father's identity remains mystery, that David's imagination tortures him with possibilities that range from new love that replaced what he destroyed to circumstances that his abandonment had made necessary when financial pressure and emotional devastation had created vulnerabilities that better men might have exploited through offering comfort that his betrayal had made her desperate enough to accept despite wisdom that normally would have protected her from poor decisions. The pregnancy that shows clearly beneath uniform creates questions that David has no right to ask but can't stop wondering about. Whether she'd found love again after his betrayal, whether desperation had led to choices that his departure had made necessary, whether the child represents hope or burden in life that his abandonment had complicated beyond anything that medical degree could solve when professional success becomes meaningless if personal relationships provide no foundation for building future that makes sense despite achievements that society celebrates while ignoring costs that individuals pay when success comes at expense of connections that give life meaning beyond material accumulation. His business associates order expensive wine while discussing deals that would make them richer at expense of workers whose wages they consider excessive. Their casual cruelty toward people they consider beneath their notice, creating context that makes David realize why Amara had needed protecting from social circle that his wealth had required him to maintain despite moral compromises that membership demanded when racism became price of admission to establishments that his money could access. But his conscience should have refused. Their conversation about cost-cutting measures that eliminate jobs reveals exactly why his mother had threatened disinheritance if he'd remained married to a woman whose presence would have challenged comfortable assumptions about superiority that wealth creates when privilege provides distance from consequences that other people suffer. The evening becomes exercise in sustained torture as David observes Amara handle their tables, increasingly demanding requests with patience that service requires, but that his betrayal doesn't deserve. Her professionalism, maintaining distance that protects her dignity, while his presence makes work nearly impossible when past and present create cognitive dissonance that threatens emotional equilibrium that pregnancy demands for health that stress could compromise if composure fails under pressure that seeing him inevitably creates despite time that should have provided healing, but that clearly remains incomplete when wounds cut as deep as abandonment had carved in a heart that had trusted completely before betrayal had taught her that even marriages couldn't provide security that love had promised, but that social pressure had destroyed. The moment of crisis comes when one of David's associates makes casually racist comment about these people, while gesturing dismissively toward Amara as she clears nearby table. His words creating flash of rage in David that comes too late for redemption, but not too late for recognition that his silence had enabled exactly this kind of dehumanization that his marriage should have forced him to confront rather than avoid when love demanded courage that his character had failed to provide. Despite vows that should have made defending her automatic rather than optional, when circumstances tested commitment, that time had revealed as conditional rather than absolute despite promises that wedding day had seemed to make permanent. "Shut up, Richard," David says sharply, his defense of Amara coming years too late, but feeling necessary despite futility that makes gesture meaningless when damage has already been done through silence that had enabled systematic dehumanization of women whose worth his associates could never comprehend because prejudice had blinded them to everything that made their marriage the best thing that had ever happened to someone whose privilege had never taught him to recognize authentic treasure, until losing it had become consequence of choices that moral clarity would have prevented if character had matched ambition in determining priorities that define lives through decisions that reveal true values when pressure test principles that education had taught but experience had failed to reinforce when courage was required. The confrontation with his business associate creates scene that draws attention throughout restaurant as David's suppressed guilt explodes into public defense of woman whose honor he should have protected throughout their marriage instead of abandoning when social pressure had demanded choices between authenticity and acceptance, love and security, personal integrity and professional advancement that his weakness had resolved through betrayal rather than courage when genuine character would have demanded standing firm despite consequences that his privilege had made him too weak to accept as price of maintaining relationships that mattered more than money. Amara approaches their table with practiced calm despite chaos that David's outburst has created. Her professional training taking over when personal emotions threaten composure that service demands despite circumstances that would challenge anyone's ability to maintain dignity when confronted with person whose betrayal had destroyed everything she'd built through years of loving someone who'd ultimately chosen convenience over commitment when testing revealed true priorities despite promises that wedding vows had seemed to guarantee until social pressure had proven stronger than marital bonds that time had revealed as conditional rather than permanent. "Gentlemen, perhaps I could bring the check," she suggests diplomatically, her voice steady despite situation that David's presence has created, her words providing escape route for everyone involved while protecting employment. That pregnancy makes essential despite education that should have provided better options if his abandonment hadn't destroyed financial stability that medical practice had created through competence that his departure had made irrelevant when emotional trauma had interfered with professional performance in ways that his betrayal had caused, but that she'd been forced to handle alone without support that marriage should have provided during crisis that his choices had created. David's response comes as mixture of desperation and recognition that this moment represents perhaps final opportunity for acknowledgement, if not redemption. Understanding that Amara deserves truth that his cowardice had prevented during divorce proceedings when lawyers had handled communication that courage should have required him to manage personally despite discomfort that honesty would have demanded when facing consequences that his choices had created for woman whose only mistake had been trusting promises that his character hadn't been strong enough to keep when circumstances had tested commitment that time had revealed as inadequate. "Amara, please. I know you're working, but could we talk? Just for a moment," David asks, his voice carrying vulnerability that success normally hides, but that seeing her has stripped away, revealing man whose wealth can't compensate for emptiness that losing her had created, whose achievements feel meaningless without relationship that had given life purpose before his choices had reduced everything to nothing through abandonment, that no amount of financial success could justify or repair despite comfortable lies that time had allowed him to construct about necessity, that had disguised moral failure when courage would have demanded different choices. Her pause before responding contains entire marriage, its joy and destruction, its promises and betrayals, its potential for redemption and permanent damage when trust becomes casualty of choices that seemed rational until consequences made them unforgivable despite time that should have provided perspective, but that clearly remains insufficient for healing wounds that cut as deep as his abandonment had carved in a heart that had loved completely before betrayal had taught lessons about. Reliability that his behavior had written in pain rather than taught through example, that marriage should have provided when partnership demanded mutual support rather than individual advancement at expense of shared commitment. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm working," Amara responds finally, her words creating professional distance that protects dignity while acknowledging reality that their history can't be addressed in an environment where employment demands focus despite emotional chaos that his presence inevitably creates when past and present collide in ways that restaurant can't accommodate despite wealth that his table represents, when survival requires attention that personal relationships must surrender to practical needs, that pregnancy makes urgent despite medical degree that should have provided security if his betrayal hadn't destroyed financial stability that their partnership had created through shared effort and mutual support. The rejection stings, but feels deserved as David recognizes that Amara has every right to refuse engagement with person whose choices had destroyed everything they'd built, whose betrayal had created circumstances that reduced brilliant physician to service work, while carrying child whose future his abandonment had complicated beyond anything that money could solve, when damage extended beyond financial into emotional territory, where healing required more than wealth could provide despite resources that guilt might offer, but that wounded hearts couldn't necessarily accept, when trust had been destroyed through choices that time might soften, but couldn't completely repair without forgiveness that victims decide rather than perpetrators demand. The evening ends with David leaving restaurant while Amara continues her shift, their brief encounter creating emotional devastation that success can't cure, recognition can't repair, and time apparently can't heal, when betrayal cuts deep enough to sever connections that seemed permanent until choices revealed them as conditional rather than absolute, despite vows that wedding day had seemed to make binding, until social pressure had proven stronger than marital bonds that his weakness had allowed to break rather than defending, when courage would have demanded different priorities than his character had been able to maintain under pressure. In the days that follow, David finds himself unable to concentrate on business that once provided escape from personal emptiness, his thoughts returning obsessively to image of Amara serving tables while carrying child whose circumstances his abandonment had created or complicated through choices that seemed necessary at time, but that perspective reveals as moral failure disguised as practical decision, when convenience had been chosen over character, acceptance over authenticity, financial security over emotional integrity, in calculations that his upbringing had made seem rational, until consequences forced recognition of what he'd actually sacrificed for approval that now feels meaningless. Private investigation that his guilt demands reveals details that make his regret even more devastating. Amara had lost her medical practice 6 months after their divorce, when depression and financial pressure had made maintaining professional standards impossible. Her patients transferred to other physicians while she'd struggled with emotional trauma that his betrayal had created, while facing financial obligations that single income couldn't manage despite medical degree that should have provided security if abandonment hadn't destroyed stability that partnership had created through shared effort and mutual support that their marriage had represented before his choices had reduced everything to nothing. The child she carries belongs to Marcus Thompson, emergency room physician who'd offered comfort during her darkest period, when David's abandonment had left her vulnerable to poor decisions that desperation had made seem reasonable despite wisdom that normally would have protected her from choices that pregnancy now makes permanent regardless of whether relationship with child's father can survive pressure that circumstances have created through complexity that is betrayal, had initiated even. If other people's actions had complicated situation beyond anything that simple solutions could address, when damage extends into multiple lives through ripple effects that single act of betrayal can create. David's attempts to offer financial assistance through lawyers meet with rejection that his wealth can't overcome. Amara's pride refusing help from person whose betrayal had created circumstances that money might alleviate but couldn't cure when damage extended beyond financial into emotional territory, where healing required more than resources could provide despite guilt that motivated offers of support that wounded hearts couldn't necessarily accept when trust had been destroyed through. Choices that generosity couldn't repair without forgiveness that victims must decide rather than perpetrators demand through wealth that convenience might offer but that integrity might refuse. The pregnancy progresses as David watches from distance that respect demands, but that guilt makes unbearable. His surveillance revealing Amara's struggle with multiple jobs that education shouldn't require, but that his abandonment had made necessary when divorce had destroyed more than just marriage, creating financial devastation that physicians' training couldn't prevent when emotional trauma had interfered with professional competence in ways that his betrayal had caused, but that she'd been forced to handle alone without support that partnership should have provided during crisis that his choices had created through weakness disguised as strength when conformity had felt easier than courage. 6 months later, news of child's birth reaches David through networks that wealth maintains despite personal isolation that success has created. His knowledge of daughter, named Grace, carrying irony that cuts through every defense that time had allowed him to construct about necessity that had disguised moral failure, when choices had revealed character that business achievements couldn't compensate for despite success that society celebrated, while ignoring costs that individuals paid when advancement came at expense of relationships that gave life meaning beyond material accumulation that his betrayal had prioritized over love. The restaurant where their worlds had collided continues serving Manhattan's elite while Amara works different establishment, her life moving forward despite damage that his choices had created, her strength evident in survival that single motherhood demands while his emptiness grows despite wealth that can't fill void that losing her had carved into existence that feels increasingly meaningless when measured against happiness that authentic love had provided before social pressure had convinced him that conformity mattered more than connection, acceptance more than authenticity, approval more than the woman whose heart he'd broken through cowardice that time had revealed as defining characteristic despite business success that masked personal failure. Years pass with David watching from afar as Amara rebuilds life that his betrayal had shattered, her resilience evident in medical career that eventually recovers despite obstacles that single motherhood creates, her daughter growing into child whose intelligence and beauty reflect maternal strength that adversity has refined rather than broken when character proved stronger than circumstances that might have destroyed spirits less tempered by principles that remained intact despite external pressures that had tested everything she believed about love, marriage, and reliability of people whose promises had seemed sincere until consequences revealed true priorities when social acceptance competed with personal commitment. The millionaire who'd frozen upon seeing his pregnant ex-wife serving tables learns that some decisions create consequences that wealth can't repair, success can't justify, and time can't completely heal when betrayal severs connections that seemed permanent until choices revealed them as conditional rather than absolute. His story becomes cautionary tale about costs of choosing social acceptance over authentic love, financial security over emotional integrity, convenience over character when pressure tests principles that define lives through decisions that reveal true values despite comfortable lies that privilege allows, when accountability demands facing truth that success often obscures until consequences make denial impossible, and redemption requires more than money can provide when forgiveness must be earned rather than purchased through wealth that convenience offers, but that wounded hearts decide whether to accept.